had a little number of statements yesterday relating to the issue of if you don't say Mashi Faruach or you don't say Moridatal or you don't mention the clouds, which we never mention, it's not a problem because these things never stop, which led to a number of meteorological statements, a number of them in the name of Rava. So now we're going to have, continuing with some statements of Rava, which have a loose tie-in, and then they'll broaden a little bit. So let's take a look. The second line from the top. Ve'amar Rava, and Rava also says, Hai Tzurba Mirabanan, a young rabbinic student. So Tzurba means like a young rabbinic student. Dami lepartzida. It's like a partzida, which is like a little sprout, a tiny little seed under the ground. The tusekala that is under like a clump of earth that's under the ground. The kivan de navat. Once it starts like sprouting forth, it begins to sprout forth. Like, this is a person, I guess, that's, with a lot of, at the beginning of their career. So once things start, once they start to becoming successful and growing, then like it's something like it's a sprout shoots out of the ground and it just grows from there. So Ve'amar Rava, and Rava also said, Hai Tzurba Mirabanan deratach. Now we're going to talk about young rabbinic students, not with the whole more agricultural metaphor, which we were dealing with, which is the obvious tie-in, but now we're broadening it a little bit. So if you have a young rabbinic student deratach that gets very angry, so you should try to be a little bit understanding, seems to be Rava's point. It's the Torah in him that's like burning up in him, and it might cause him to act like inappropriately, maybe a little bit overly passionate. Shenemar, as the verse says, Halo kol devarai ke'esh num Hashem. So are my words like fire, says God. So somebody, is very like religiously motivated, excited, feels the passion of it, they might lead them to get angry or to overreact. So he's not condoning it, but he's trying to help contextualize it. V'amar Rav Ashi, and says Rav Ashi, Kol Talmid Chacham she'eino kasher kebarzel. Now Rav Ashi seems to, whereas Rava's statement could be interpreted a little bit more as explaining and contextualizing, Rav Ashi seems to be like condoning that any Talmid Chacham who's not as strong and as hard as iron, eino Talmid Chacham. It's not a real Talmid Chacham. Shenemar, as the verse says, and like a hammer which will shatter a rock. So maybe, if you have to have that single-mindedness and that sense of conviction, and focus in order to just, to pursue your Torah studies, you need to be sometimes a little bit hard, not a pushover. Then Amalei Rabbi Abba Rav Ashi. Rabbi Abba said to Rav Ashi, Atun mehasamas nisula. You learn it out from there. Anan. So we mehachamas nisula. We learn it out from the following pasuk. Tichsiv. The verse says, Eretz Asher Avaneha Barzel, land whose rocks are iron. Al Tikri Avaneha, do not read rocks, Ela Boneha, those that build it. That's, the famous way the Chazal learned the word Bonayich, right? Rav Shalom Bonayich, Al Tikri Bonayich, Bonayich, those that like build the world and so on. So they're as hard as iron. Now again, clearly it seems to be more condoning. This is appropriate. Even the association with Bonayich to build, like you want your building materials to be out of iron. So there's some sense here that sometimes, you need to be strong in this type of religious pursuit. Yes.
There's another layer or play to that and the famous midrash that you just brought in. That this word boneha and bonayich builds on the shorish lahavin. That is, those who come to understand it, as in like the shorish lavon.
Right. So yeah, that's a good question. I mean, people do all wonder, like, what is that common drush of, like, banayich and bonayich, and is it builders or is it like, right, tivuna and understanding? So yeah, thank you for that. Right. Okay, so here is again, it's sort of saying that it's like sometimes, you got to be a little bit strong in your focus and your convictions, and also if it's a pursuit of truth, then in your standing up for what's right. Amar Avinu, but now we get the counterbalancing, similarly to the way that Rava seemed more to be contextualizing than sort of praising or condoning. Here we move to a type of a praising approach, but now we're still going to balance it. So said Ravina, afilu hachi, even if all of that is true, you have to teach yourself how to deal pleasantly with people. Like it could very be nice, you're strong and you have your convictions, but teach yourself how to deal pleasantly. Shenemar, as the verse says, "V'haser ka'as milibcha," remove anger from your heart. So that a little bit seems to be going back to Rava, who speaks about meratchale, angered, But here it's also put here to juxtapose the statement of Rav Ashi. So it's all very nice at passion and conviction, and strength of character. But there's also a way that you interact, with other people, and you learn how to do that properly. It sort of reminded me of that statement by what's his name, but the statement is quoted in so many different ways by Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. What is it? That any rabbi, do people know this line? What is it? And any rabbi who's something like any rabbi who doesn't stand up to his congregation isn't a man, but any rabbi whose congregation whatever isn't a mensch. I don't know. There's some type of good statement like that. It is, but I forget the exact line. Anyway, but it's about the idea of on the one hand you have to not be a pushover, and you're standing for Torah and you're standing for truth, and you have to have that conviction. At the other hand, you have to be able to deal with interact with people in a menschlich way. All right, so now the Gemara gets back to it's still in an agadic mode, but we'll circle back to our theme here. So let's take a look. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar Rabbi Yonasan Shlosha shalu shelo kahogen. 3 asked inappropriately. Lishnayim hishivuhu or heshivum kahogen. 2 were responded, even though their request was inappropriate and could have led to something disastrous, as we'll see. They got the right response they got the response that was appropriate. One person, the response was inappropriate, corresponding to the way it was requested. The Eluhain, these are the 3. Eliezer Eved Avraham, Eliezer the servant of Avraham. The reason it's be called Eved Avraham here is because it's talking about the story with Rivka, where he's never identified in the Torah as Eliezer, just as Eved Avraham. But Chazal identify him as Eliezer. What? Well, we will see. The Shaul ben Kish and Shaul, the Yiftach HaGiladi and Yiftach. Eliezer Eved Avram Tichsiv, Eliezer the servant of Avram, as it says, V'aya na'ara asher omar elai tina chadeich ve'ashteh and she'll say to me, Shesei v'gam g'olech hashka u'tahu chachta lav d'chal Yitzchak. Right, that will be the one you've chosen for Yitzchak. So whoever passes the test, he said, that'll be the one. Yachol afilu chigeres afilu suma. Maybe it would even if she would be lame, even if she'd be blind, somebody that wouldn't be appropriate for Yitzchak. We're not going to get into here against the whole problem with, how approaching people with disabilities. But okay, maybe somebody could pass the test and not be appropriate.
And she would necessarily be drawing water.
For other reasons. Okay. So anyway, Rashi, it also says, but it doesn't end. In order to pass the test, he first has to say to her, give me the drink. Right. So why can't he check these things out before he says to her? Well, he says, maybe it's not an obvious disability and so on. Maybe it's hidden. But anyway, we won't also deal again with the, I think, a deeper problem here about categorizing people's disabilities. Anyway, Hashivu Kahogan, he got the woman he was looking for. He's Damnalo Rivka. And exactly the right woman chanced upon him, so it could have been you could pass the test and still not be the right person. And nevertheless, Baruch Hashem, it worked out. Shaul ben Kish Tichsiv, this is by Goliath, Goliath. He says that Shaul said, whoever smites him, the king will enrich him with great wealth and give him his daughter as a wife. What, anybody who passes the test, even a slave, even a mamzer? So, it's one thing to give him wealth, but you marry off your daughter to him? So, Hashivo Kahogan, nevertheless, even though he wasn't careful in how he framed it, and it could have been a bad result, he got exactly the appropriate result. And he's Damlo David, and David was the one. Not that Shaul was so happy with David in the future, but okay, at least it was the right, of all the possible, results, that was the best. Yiftach HaGiladi, now Yiftach is the most fascinating one. Tichsiv, it will be the thing that comes out of my door first when I come back from the war. I will offer it as a sacrifice to God. So he said, whatever comes out of my door. So it says, Yachol afilu davar tamei. maybe even, and he wasn't careful, maybe it would have even referred to, let's say, a non-kosher thing like a pig. Now, of course, it's quite funny because it could have said maybe even if it's a person, which is exactly what happened. But maybe it means that even if he wasn't even thinking about that possibility, he should have at least been thinking about the possibility that it could be a non-kosher animal. Hashivo Shalok Ahogan, and he got what was sort of his comeuppance there. It didn't work out. Yeah, we don't know. It's fascinating. It doesn't reflect on like why was that, that God allowed the first two to work out well and this one not. Shenamar, as the verse says, I'm sorry, and it was his daughter that walked out of the door. And this is what the Navi says to Israel in Yirmiyahu. Hatzari ein b'Gilad imofei ein sham. Is there no myrrh in Gilad? Is there no healing there? So Gilad is Yiftach HaGiladi, and the Navi is bemoaning the fact that obviously because the problem with those psukim are that the problem with the story of Yiftach is not just that Yiftach did what he did. I mean, okay, so it was one person. You don't know, maybe it was obviously considered a heinous act. But if you read the story, there's nothing in the story of Yiftach other than the fact that it's like a tragic that this girl has to, die at a young age. There's nothing in the way that Navi tells the story of Yiftach that makes it sound like this thing is like horrific from a religious standpoint, right? It was just terrible that this young girl had to, she got all her friends around. She mourned over her the fact that she'll die a virgin. But there's nothing there that makes it seem like this thing is like fundamentally religiously abhorrent. So the Gemara here is trying to express the idea. It's a funny thing. On the one hand, he sort of got what was coming to him, but part of the message is like, yeah, but we see in other stories that God sort of could, had a way of making things work out. God here allowed it or intentionally made it work out bad, which seems to even more heighten the problem that this is not being sort of condemned, and therefore now we're going to quote psukim though to balance that says that God was very that this was unacceptable. So the first psukim that we're quoting, is that there was no healing, that this was a terrible thing, and it was and there was no way to heal, this problem. Rashi also says that it alludes to the fact that the midrash that says that Pinchas was around at that time, and he could have gone to Pinchas to be matir the neder, and he didn't. And Pinchas didn't go to him. Pinchas said, "Let him come to me," and Yiftach said, "Let Pinchas come to me." And therefore, they both sort of were punished for not trying to solve the problem and be matir the neder. And that's also this hatzari ein b'Gilad. Why is nobody solving this problem? But again, what the Gemara is trying to do, and it is very funny because the first thing is oh, so God wanted this to happen. So God was all controlling this, by certainly contrasting it to the other two stories, and then at the same time saying that this was completely unacceptable, which is even more heightened in the next pasuk. So let's just read the next pasuk, and it says, I'll get back to you in a second. It says, Ksiv, and the other verse says, right, in Yirmiyahu, Asher, referring to the fact that Bnei Israel would offer up their children, in these fire offerings, this type of child sacrifice, and the verse there says, Asher lo tzivisi v'lo dibarti v'lo asali bi. That Bnei Israel would do these, child sacrifices. I think to the Molech is the context, or it's in the Gei Ben Hinnom. Bamot Abal. Thank you. Lishrofes B'neihem. Thank you. Okay. I think so. It's and it says that I did not command, and I never spoke, and it never occurred to me. This is something that I never wanted. Child sacrifice. So the Gemara here says, in a way, this is a very, the Gemara sort of here, based on this verse, pulls together stories which sort of are a little problematic, make you a little bit question how much has child sacrifice been completely eradicated and completely something God does not want. So let's take a look. So it says, Asher lo tzivisi, that I never commanded, Zeh b'no shel Mesha melech Moav. This is the son of Mesha, the king of Moab. Shenema, the verse says, "Vayikachas b'no b'chor asher yimloch tachtav v'yaleu olah." So now this is about a non-Jew, fine, but if you know the story there, they're going to war against Israel, and it looks like Moab is about to be destroyed, and he takes his son, which would have been his the king underneath him, and he brings him up as a sacrifice, and then the next thing is that Bnei Israel, sort of the war breaks off. They don't succeed. They don't vanquish him. So it seems like his sacrifice was accepted, because after he offers up his son as a sacrifice, they escape defeat. So it had a positive effect, or at least if you sort of, what is it? What's the point? Juxtaposition is not causality, right? Just because one thing follows the other doesn't mean that it was causal. But and Torah never says like God answered him, but after he offers up his son, they don't get defeated like it looked like they were both about to suffer imminent defeat. So it says, oh, but I never wanted that. I wasn't asking for that. I didn't want that. That's not what that was about. Okay, the lo dibarti, I never spoke it. Zay yiftach, I never told Yiftach to do it. It was him. He did it himself. Okay, the lo alta libi, it never even occurred to me. Zay Yitzchak ben Avraham. That was Yitzchak. I said haleu leolah, but I never really occurred to me that would really be how it would be play out. I just did it as a test. Or I did it because I meant bring him up, but I didn't mean it like Rashi, the famous Rashi, what's the Midrash. I didn't literally mean sacrificing. Okay, maybe it's probably also a play on the word Alta and Valeu Ola, although Alta also occurred by what do you call it? By Mesha Melech Moab. So here the Gemara, and this actually is interesting because some scholars actually do raise this question, which is how much was the idea or the impetus for child sacrifice really completely eradicated? If you just think about some of the midrashim by the case of the Akedah, first of all, the Akedah presents, of course, for us a lot of very deep religious issues nowadays, in the sense of following a religious mandate, even if it's unethical, calls for murder and so on, especially in the day now, things we deal with religious fundamentalism, which starts all the way, the earliest sort of problematizing of that with the Akedah, or the most famous, goes back to Kierkegaard, but that's not necessarily how the Akedah was looked at traditionally. The Akedah traditionally was not looked at as the challenge of, do you listen to God against the sense of morality and right and wrong? Like if you think about what we say in the liturgy we say, right, that Kishem Shelo Kavash Avram Avinu Es Rachamav Lasos Ritzon Chableiv Kishem Shekavash Avram Avinu Es Rachamav Lasos Ritzon Chableiv Shalem Ken Yichbash Rachames Kaskasak. Avram was willing to overcome his compassion, to give what is most dear to him, to do your will. You, God, should be able to overcome your anger against us. So it wasn't that he overcame his sense of right and wrong, but he gave over what was most dear to him, right? So it's not problematized as a fundamental issue of morality and murder. It's just doing what is most dear. So, and that was the test. And if you think about the Rashi, Rashi quoting the Midrash, it's really a Midrash Beishas Rabbah, but when it says Avram took the ram and what is it? Tachas beno. Right? Says, what does tachas beno mean? It means as he was shechting the ram, he said, "Let this be like I'm shechting Yitzchak." And as he was sprinkling the blood, he says, "Let this be like the blood of you." Very graphic. But what it's basically saying is that impetus for a child sacrifice doesn't just go away. And even if God's saying give a substitute, it doesn't mean that it gets eradicated. And there's that sense of in certain people's minds. Somebody told me this could only be men. Like women would never think this way. A mother would never think this way. But there's this sense of give what's most dear. You give your first son. If everybody ever see the movie Noah. So anyway, okay, I won't ruin it for you. But at the end, you have a scene just like that. The father or the grandfather, like he thinks God wants my son. The mother will never think that way. But anyway, so what this is doing is it's actually pointing out that there are cases in the Tanakh where it seems like people are acting on this, and it doesn't seem to be completely condemned. The story of Yiftach, the story of Mesha, Melech Moab, which again brings God and Bnei Israel into that equation. So the Gemara here is based on the pasuk in Yirmiyahu, and it seems to be that is part of Yirmiyahu's rhetoric, is insisting, don't read those stories that way. The stories should not be read that there would ever be a hint that God would want this, and that was completely something that never God had desired. And that Gemara, though, is dealing with that tension here. So on the one hand, Hashivo Shelo Kahogen, and God could have made something else occur, but he made the daughter be the one, or God allowed for the daughter to be the one. And on the other hand, don't interpret this to mean that this is something that God ever wanted. God would never want this. This was completely unacceptable. So let's just read a little bit more. I'll take the question. So the Gemara says like this. Amar Reb Brachya, Af Knesset Yisrael Shalosh Shalo Kahogan. Even the Knesset Yisrael asked inappropriately. V'Akadosh Baruch Hu Yeshiva Kahogan, and this will show why this will just be the tie into our Masechet. And God responded though appropriately. Shneimar, the verse says, "V'nei da'ad nirdefa ladat et Hashem." Let us know to run to know God. Kishachar nachon motzao, like the morning or like the sun, which is a trustworthy. It's the rising of the sun. V'yavo kigeshem ulanu, and it will come down like rain to us. So Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu. So God said to the children of Israel, "Biti, my daughter, you're asking for something that sometimes is desirable and sometimes is not desirable. Like we've been learning, rain in the wrong time is a bad thing, is a klala. So you want it to be like rain. Rain isn't always desirable. I will be for you something that is always desirable. I'll be like the dew. So as we were learning yesterday, the dew is always present and always good, although discussed before, a tal of bracha and tal not of bracha, but anyway, and therefore that is God's response. Okay, we'll finish up this point. One final request that was inappropriate. Amar l'fanav Ribono shel olam, Master of the universe. Sameni kachotam al libecha, kachotam al zroecha. Make me like a seal on your heart, like a seal on your arm. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu. God said, "Biti." You ask me something that sometimes is visible, sometimes is not. Things that are on your arm, could be covered up with your clothes, with your sleeves. I will be for you something that is always seen. Behold, I have carved you onto my, very palms, something that is always visible. So I just want to say, by the way, besides the idea here of the issue of Tal versus Geshem, the other important theme that this is bringing up, which is a major, major theme of this Masechet, is rain as a metaphor, maybe even better to say, as a not even as a metaphor, as an expression of God's closeness to Bnei Yisrael. Part of the whole issue of is it raining, is it not raining, is not just we need the rain for the crops, but are we finding favor with God or not finding favor with God? If it's not raining, that means that God is distant from us. The rain comes down from the heaven. It's the most sort of, most physical thing that expresses, if you think about it, it's almost like the reverse of sacrifices, right? The sacrifices, you make a fire and it goes up to heaven. And the rain, is the life-giving thing that comes down from heaven. And it's that powerful, I'd say, not only even a symbol, but in the sense of powerful, a manifestation of God's desiring and connecting to Bnei Yisrael. So here that theme is really brought up in the sense of be like rain, be like dew. We're expressing that relationship between God and Bnei Yisrael. Okay, there were a few questions. Charlie.
Yeah, Yiftach is not the only bad event in Sefer Shoftim that seems to not get condemned, but later on the Nevi'im seem to be more likely to condemn the actions of a lot of the bad kings,
right?
The idolatry,
right?
So there's a question: why is Sefer Shoftim so much just plain stam narrative?
Why does it give him a pass?
Yeah,
as much. But yeah, I agree. So that's a question. And again, the question is exactly quoting the pasuk in Yirmiyahu. Is it that maybe this thing was not seen as horrific, earlier on, So right. I mean, that's the question. When God says don't bring Yitzchak, is God saying because child sacrifice is completely horrific and I never want it, or is God just saying I'm not asking that from you? But not like that. The thing itself is incomprehensible, right? So obviously, we would like to think the former, but yeah.
On the other subject of child sacrifice, the current Biblical Archaeology Review has an article on child sacrifice.
Okay.
Specifically on Carthage, which was a Phoenician Canaanite colony,
right.
And the conclusion is, they did it.
Yeah.
And it was not that uncommon.
Right. Yeah.
What I would say is that it's one thing to point out by the other psukim that God didn't say to you, I want to sacrifice something, and you didn't say to Misha, I'm not allowed to sacrifice your son. Okay, then you can sort of get away with it if God didn't want it.
Right.
With Yitzchak, it's a little bit harder.
Well, that I think is why it leaves the Asher Lo Alta Al Libi for Yitzchak, because by Yitzchak it was Tzivisi and it was Dibarti, it just wasn't Alta Al Libi. That's what I think it's saying. Yeah, I said it, but I wasn't playing. I didn't mean it. I said it, but I didn't mean it. Okay. Ain't showing. So anyway, that ends that discussion. An agadic end to the whole issue about taint talumatar and about morid hatal, not saying it, and not saying if you even dropped off the mashli haruach, that doesn't cease. I should just mention the halacha that. Okay, so it says you don't have to say morid hatal at any time. In theory, you could say it at all times. You could say in the winter, in the winter and fall, morid hatal, mashli haruach, morid hageshem, if you want to, and you could say it during the summer and the spring, morid hatal. But it says you don't have to. So Tosfos quotes a Yerushalmi that says that if you say morid hatal instead, and let's say you say it all the time, but let's say you say it in the summer, but then you kept on saying it in the rainy season as well, and you forgot to say mashli haruach, that morid hageshem, that you don't have to go back. Because now, and therefore, they leads to a position in Tosfos, which is not the position of the Ramah and most Ashkenazim, but it is, I believe, the position of Svardim. Correct me, Dov, if I'm wrong. And I believe other certain strands of Ashkenazi Nusach, which is that you say Morid Hatal in the summer, and in the summer and in the spring, and therefore the side benefit of it. Gemara never says it's bad to say Morid Hatal; it just says you don't have to say Morid Hatal. So okay, you'll mention another Shevach V'Kadosh Baruch Hu. Why is that bad? No problem. And the other benefit of it is that if you forget to say Mashiv Haruach, once it Morid Hageshem, specifically Morid Hageshem, once it becomes like after Sukkot, and you just say what you've been used to saying, which is Morid Hatal, then you don't have to go back. So it's perfect. You don't have to wonder, oh, did I remember? Did I not remember? I suffix first 30 days. I go back afterwards. I don't go back. If you won't, you'll never have to go back because in worst cases, you said Morid Hatal. But by the way, it doesn't mean you'll never go back because there could still be a problem the other half of the year when you're supposed to stop saying Morid Hageshem, right? And it becomes actually, the post-Pesach period, and you're supposed, and then if you do continue to say Morid Hageshem when you're not supposed to say it, that we learned also, that's the whole idea of rain in the wrong time is a klala, or is a siman klala. So, but at least for half the year, you don't have to worry, because for half the year, either you said Mashi Baruch Morid Geshem like you should have, or you said Morid Hatal, and either way you're safe. So that's my minhag as well. Like even though it's not as much my family minhag, I figure there's no downside, and the only thing it can do is help you half the year, not have to worry about going back. The interesting thing to say about that though is this, and this is like the flip of the idea in Tosfos that came up with if you forgot Mashi Morid Hageshem, that Tosfos says you can say it in Shomei Tefillah. As I said yesterday, we don't paskin that way, but that deals with the issue of Mashiv Baruch Morid Hageshem being like an introduction to Bakasha, so not just a appropriate Shevach in that location in Shemona Esrei. And if you see it as an introduction to Bakasha, you could say it in Shomei Tefillah. If you missed it in, Mechayim Mesim, we don't paskin that way, but that's one way of looking at it. So the flip thing has to be asked about Morid Hatal. How does Morid Hatal get you out of Morid Hageshem? You need rain, so you need to be saying Geshem. Tal never ceases. So why does saying Morid Hatal get you out of the obligation of saying Morid Hageshem? So if you think that Mashi Baruch and Morid Hageshem is all about a precursor to asking for rain, then there's no reason Morid Hatal should get you out of it, because it's not about rain. But if Mashi Baruch and Morid Hageshem is about an obligation to just sort of acknowledge, God's power and the fact that God brings rain as one of the shvachim of God, so Morid Hatal is in the same category. It's recognizing God's power over the water cycle, over, the meteorological functions and so on, things that God does that help bring, sustenance to the world. So it's not about a bakasha for rain. It's just about a sheva. So Morid Hatal could be seen as a type of a substitute. So that those two questions, is Morid Hatal a substitute or an acceptable b'di'evid? And can you say Mashiv Haruach b'di'evid in Shomei Tefillah? Get to the heart of a question which we're about to resume, which is the debate of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua to some degree, which is to what degree is Mashiv Haruach Morid Hageshem really just a precursor to bakasha? Okay, yeah, some questions. And then, yeah.
I believe Ashkenazim in Israel University said Morid Hatal.
Could be. I think that's Minhag Gra. Yeah.
I was just going to say, the other thing is you only get tal when it's been cool out. You don't get dew when it's, 80, 90 degrees,
Because then it doesn't condense, it just all
right,
evaporates.
It doesn't condense.
Right.
So on some level, right, it's still a sign that you're, hopefully your crops are not gonna overheat and burn and so on. So it is something positive still when it comes to the growth.
Good point.
So
Yep.
I want to clarify, is that you're saying the only reason why Moridatal said is to be safe the other half of the year?
Not the only reason. I mean, the Gemara sort of doesn't give a heavy weight to say it or not say it. If she says, if you don't say it, it's okay, it never really says you. It's a little bit alludes to the idea that maybe you're supposed to say it, but never really makes that point either. So no, I've said like, okay, so first of all, say it. It's a positive. The Gemara, certainly never says it's a bad thing to say it. If anything, it's a positive thing to say it because it's another shevach of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But it has a real benefit in terms of this other thing. But I'm not saying it's the only reason. Okay, so let's now move on. So that's a good segue into this discussion, which we're going to again visit the relationship of maskirim and shoalim. So the Mishnah opens with the case of mentioning Mashi Baruch Morid Geshem. Then it goes. There's a lot of back and forth referred between mentioning and asking maskirim v'shoalim, maskirim shoalim. So we have had that debate about when do you say it. Now we have this one line in the Mishnah, which is Ein sholim es geshamim ela samach. What's it? Ela samach legeshamim, right? Ein sholim es. You only ask for rain. Tein talamatu livracha. Yeah. I'm just looking for the rain. Ela samach legeshamim, near the time of the rain. Now that's not so clear what the time of the rain is. Now, if you take a peek ahead at the next, not the actual, the next Mishnah. Well, it's a big ahead, but let me tell you where it is. The Mishnah on Daf Yud Amud Aleph, no, not that one, because that tells Yud Amud Aleph. It says, right, Begimel b'marcheshva and sholi nefesh geshamim. Rabbi Gamliel omer b'shivavo. Okay, Tetvav Yom Achar Chag Kadei Shagia Acham Shebisrael and Har Pras. So when do you ask? 3 of Marcheshvan or 7 of Marcheshvan. So that seems to be the clarification of what Samach L'Geshami means. Although you start saying Mashi Baruch Morid Geshem at latest after Sukkot is over, right? Shmini Atzeres, that's when you start saying it. The whole debate was all of Sukkot or at the end of Sukkot. But the actual asking for it, that you wait till it's much more the fully appropriate time, till it's the 3rd or 7th of Mar Cheshvan. That's presumably how the Mishnah reads. But the Gemara is not going to necessarily assume that. So let's take a look. Ein Sholim Zakav Savrua, we assumed She'ela v'yaskara Chad Yosahi. So the Gemara says, fascinatingly, although Rabbi Eliezer explicitly says not this way, Rabbi Eliezer says, no, I'm talking about lahazkir, not lishol. The Gemara is saying, we're assuming that maybe within Rabbi Yoshua, since Rabbi Yoshua doesn't buy into saying Mashiv HaRuach not at before you want it. Rabbi Yoshua's whole point is, you don't say Mashiv HaRuach until you really want the rain, until it really will be good. So maybe according to him, those 2 times are exactly the same. There's no gap between Mashiv HaRuach and Tein Talud Matar. She'ela and Haskara occur at the same time, at least according to Rabbi Yoshua. That's what we're assuming. So, Tana. So who is this Tana that says that you start asking for it right? When it's the time of rain. Amarava Rabbi Yoshua. Amar Mishas Hanachaso. It's Rabbi Yoshua that says when you start asking for it after you put down the lulav, which presumably means Shmini Atzeret. And now the Gemara is assuming that not only does he say that you start saying Mashif HaRuach, but you start saying Tein Talud Matar. I mean, you don't say it on Shmini Atzeret, but fine, you start saying it the next day. Okay, that those are exactly the same time. Abai said no. I feel time Rabbi Eliezer, even Rabbi Eliezer, she'elu l'chud v'askara l'chud, which is what Rabbi Eliezer said in the Mishnah, right? Rabbi Eliezer could agree that you ask for it later. He just says that mentioning it comes earlier. So again, the assumption here that you asked for it, when it's closer to the time that you want it, does not necessarily mean that you wait to mention it. The mentioning could begin earlier. The Igadami, and some say, Lema Rabbi Yoshua he da'amar mishas hanachato, so that it started more with like a question, not a statement. Maybe this idea that you say, that you start asking Tein Talud Matar, that maybe that's only Rabbi Eliezer, because assumingly that would mean not only do you start saying Tein Talud Matar later, but you start saying Mashif HaRuach later, so that would only be a Rabbi Yoshua idea that says Mashif HaRuach comes later. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava, no, afilu tema Rabbi Eliezer, it could even be Rabbi Eliezer, she'elu l'chud v'askara l'chud. It could be that you ask for it later, but you mention it earlier. Again, it seems to be like very obvious that that's what's going on in the Mishnah, but it's raising the question that while Rabbi Eliezer says it explicitly, that I'm okay saying Mashiv HaRuach during Sukkot, before you say Mashiv, before you start asking, is that true according to Rabbi Yehoshua? Is it possible, so since Rabbi Yehoshua says you don't say Mashiv HaRuach until you would want the rain to happen, and that's our idea that Mashiv HaRuach is a precursor to Tein Talmud Matar, maybe he doesn't have a gap of time at all between those two, and maybe he would actually say that you start saying both of them as soon as Sukkot is out. And we're going to continue with that possibility right here. Let's take a look. Rabbi Yehuda Omer over Lifnei HaTeva, the one who, if you begin the davening, that the Baal Shachris and Shmini Atzeres does not say it, and the Baal Musaf says Mashiv HaRuach. Ramini, I'll ask you on this. And Masai Charlie Masik Shamim, until when do you ask for it? And at the opposite end, the Baal Shachris for the first day of Pesach says it, and the Baal Musaf does not say it. But you say it until the beginning of Pesach. So we've got a Mishnah, the next Mishnah coming up, and this is the Mishnah, hey, not when you begin, but when you end. And Matai Sholim is Geshamim, until when do you ask for the rain? Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ad Sheyavor HaPesach, until Pesach is done, until Pesach is over. Rabbi Meir Omer Ad Sheyavor Nisan, until all of Nisan is over. So we'll put aside Rabbi Meir for now, but Rabbi Yehuda on the one hand says you say it until the first day of Pesach, you switch over at Musaf, and in the next Mishnah, he says you say it throughout Pesach, until Pesach is passed over. Excuse the pod. Okay, anyway, so Amar Rav Chisda, Lokash, it's not difficult. Kan Lisho, Kan Lahazkir. Okay, so it says, because our Mishnah, now again we're getting to this question of do these things overlap or not. Our Mishnah has him say, you stop saying Mashiv HaRuach U'Morid HaGeshem on the first day of Pesach. But he's saying, fine, that's when you stop saying Mashiv HaRuach, but you keep on asking for it and saying Tein Talmud Matar Livracha throughout all of Pesach, which is like bizarre, right? Until now we've said, you can mention it before, but, you're asking, presumably, as long as you're asking, you're also mentioning, right? The mentioning could come prior, but why would the mentioning stop and you still be a period of asking? If you're still asking for rain, you should still be saying, Mashiv HaRuach U'Morid HaGeshem. But that's what it thinks to resolve. It would technically resolve the Mishnayot. Our Mishnah is talking about mentioning. The next Mishnah is talking about asking. So the Gemara says, okay, so let's see. Misho shoyel v'azil. You keep on asking Tein Talmud Matar Livracha through Pesach. At least you say it on Chol HaMoed. Lahazkir, to say Mashiv HaRuach, that you switch over on the first day. Yom Tov HaRishon Pasik. You stop on the first day. So Amar Ula. So Ula said, Had Rav Chisda, that statement of Rav Chisda, to think you would not say Mashiv HaRuach while you're asking for rain, Kasha is as difficult, Chometz l'shinayim u'ka'ashan le'inayim, quoting a pasuk from Mishlei, like vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes. Like that thing is like so hard to make sense. It's like it's the opposite. So umam b'makom she'eno shoel mazkir, before it's even the time to begin asking, you mention. Right, you start mentioning, according to Rabbi Yehoshua, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you mention at the beginning of Sukkot, according to Rabbi Yehoshua, although we're sort of a little bit had some question about that, but you mentioned from Shmini Atzeres until Markeshva, and you're mentioning it without asking for it. Mentioning can occur before it's appropriate to be asking. So, if you're still in a period of asking for it, it's over Pesach, and you think you're still asking for it over Pesach, then obviously you should still be saying it. How can you be asking for it and not saying it? Elamar Ula, so Ula said no. Trade Tanai, I'll leave it to Rabbi Yehuda. Easiest answer. There's a debate of Tanai and what Rabbi Yehuda said. Our Mishnah assumes he says you stop saying Mashiv HaRuach on the first day of Pesach, and therefore you would also stop saying Tein Talmud Matar, because if you're not saying Mashiv HaRuach, you're not saying Tein Talmud Matar. And the other Tana says, no, you say both of them till the end of Pesach. Okay, that's the easiest answer. It's a debate, it's two versions of Rabbi Yehuda. Now we're going to try to get more creative answers to reconcile it and have them both actually be saying the same thing. So let's take a look. Rav Yosef says, "My ad sheyavor haPesach." What does it mean that you say, Tein Talmud Matar until Pesach is done? Even though we're saying that according to our Tana, you would only say it till the first day. So ad sheyavor shliach tzibur rishon hayor b'yom tov rishon shel Pesach. That's a very creative reread. It doesn't mean until Pesach has passed over. Again, I don't mean to be making a pun anymore, but okay. It doesn't mean until Pesach has passed. It means until the shliach tzibur passes in front of the congregation on the first day of Pesach. So Ad Sheyavor Pesach means until the first day of Pesach. All right, so that's a very creative reread, but even with that reread, the Gemara doesn't buy it.
Until Musa.
Until Musa. So Amalei Abaye, so Abaye said, 1 minute. You can't say, you say Tein Telematar until Musaf of the first day of Pesach. Because when do you really stop saying Tein Telematar? Mincha before. Once it's Yantav, you don't have the bracha. You don't have Barech Aleinu, right? That's a Shana Zot, right? So Amalei Abaye, so Abaye said, She'ela b'Yantav mi'ika. You don't have asking for it on Yantav. What do you mean? You can't say you ask for it until until Musaf or until the davening on the first day of Yantav. So Amalei, yes, show Maturgaman. The translator can ask. Now that's a bizarre thing. What translator? So Rashi says, was there a translator of the davening? Was it a translator of the Kriyas HaTorah? So if you look at Rashi, Rashi says where it says Maturgaman. I'm trying to find the Rashi. Rashi says the Meturgamon. Well, actually, let's first read the line in the Gemara. So, v'chi Meturgamon shoel davar shein tzarich b'tzibur. I'm sorry. No, I was right. The first Rashi says in Sheila the Meturgamon. Rashi says bidrash about 10 lines before the lines that wide. Shu doresh bidrash shu doresh omer brach birchas she'elo levada. It's a bizarre type of idea. First of all, the Meturgaman now here is like the guy giving the sermon. I don't know why he's called the Meturgaman. Maybe the person who would translate the Kriyas HaTorah would also interrupt and give a little drasha somewhere at some point. And inserting in your sermon, maybe you'll say a bracha of, An Yantiv of Tein Telemat Livracha. Like, who's making this stuff up? So anyway, so that's what it says. That you would say until davening on the first day of Pesach. So the Gemara says, no, you don't ask if it's not needed. Now, again, isn't that partly of what's debated is whether it still is needed, until when is the rain needed. But anyway, clearly, we're not going to buy into this idea that there would be some mention of Tein Talamat Livracha on the first day outside the context of davening. So that's not a legitimate reread of that Mishnah, that you ask Tein Talamat until the first day davening because you stop asking for it earlier. Ela machvarta k'de'ula. It's better like ula. Fine. Let's just accept that it's a machlokas of Rabbi Yehuda's position. But now we're not giving up. Rabbi says another way of reconciling the two Mishnayos. My Ad Sheyavor Pesach. What does it mean until Pesach has passed? Ad Sheyavor Zman Shchitas HaPesach. So Pesach doesn't mean Chag HaMatzos. Pesach means what it means more biblically. It means the bringing of the Korban Pesach, and it means until the time of the Shechita of the Pesach has passed over. Utchit Chilato, Kain Sofo, like the beginning, so is the end. The same way at the beginning of the process, you start mentioning Mashiv HaRuach before you start asking, at least until Cheshvan. Afsofo, even at the end of the process, you stop asking, according to him. Now, I don't get why it means the time of Shechting the Pesach has passed, because Shechting the Pesach is the whole afternoon. Rashi says it means that after the morning has passed. But anyway, that is the time of Shechting the Pesach. Anyway, but okay, so in the afternoon, at Mincha time, you're no longer asking. Nevertheless, you're still mentioning. So the mentioning of it can begin earlier and continue later, but the explicit asking does not, is at a smaller period of time. So actually, Yavor HaPesach and the next Mishnah means that you stop saying Mashiv HaRuach by Musaf of Pesach of the first day, and you stop saying Tein Tolamotar like Erev Pesach or by Mincha of Erev Pesach. Amalei Abaye, so Abaye said back, okay, so logically that makes sense. It's a little difficult read of Ad Sheyavor Pesach, but Bishleim. But he says I don't understand I don't really get the logic just because you've created this parallel. Bishleim et chilaso maskir. I get that you could start mentioning it at the beginning, Mashiv HaRuach, before you start asking. Haskara nami ritzui she'elahi, and this is exactly the issue we've been discussing. How much is Mashiv HaRuach, a lead-in to saying Tein Talamata, or is it independent in terms of its function in Shemona Esrei? So he says, look, he's taking the approach that Mashiv HaRuach is a Ritzu She'elahi. It is like appeasing, laying the groundwork for making the request. First, you praise God when it's the right time about this power, and then you start asking God to act on it. Okay, so I get why it precedes. Ella Sofa, but at the end, my Ritzu She'ela Ika. Right? If you're done asking for rain, why would you keep on mentioning it? The whole idea is to mention as a lead in to ask. When the asking is done, the mentioning should be done. Again, this gets to the heart of the question of whether you see Mashiv HaRuach just in this capacity or not. But Abaye sees it just in that capacity, so he can't accept that you continue to say Mashiv HaRuach after you're done asking. Ela machvarta kid'ula. Once again, we reject these ways of reconciling, and we go back to Ula saying it's two opinions. But what this Gemara has done is it's again brought this issue of the relationship of Mashif HaRuach to Tein Talumatar. That on the one hand, we've accepted the idea that you could start saying Mashif HaRuach a good deal before you say Tein Talumatar. Certainly, that's Rabbi Eliezer's position. You say Mashif HaRuach in Sukkot, you only ask for it after. But even Rabbi Yoshua could have saying it the whole duration until Mar Cheshvan and only start asking in Mar Cheshvan. And then we asked about the end, because there seemed to be a contradiction of Reb Yehuda about when you end. And the Gemara was exploring the possibility that they would diverge there as well. But there the Gemara says no, it doesn't make sense. It makes sense that Mashif HaRuach can come before, Tein Talumatar, but you can't be, on the one hand, the first suggestion was rejected. You can't be saying Tein Talumatar without saying Mashif HaRuach. That would make no sense. And you can't even, according to Abaye, continue saying Mashif HaRuach after you've stopped asking. There would be no point, says Abaye, to continue saying it. Now, that's not as logically impossible. That has to do with the function of Mashif HaRuach, but at least Abaye says there would be no point to continue saying it if you were no longer asking for rain, no longer interested in God bringing the rain. Okay, yes.
Ritzu is that technical term we saw in the Korbanot and the Avodah, right? What was the use of the Ritzu?
Well, it says, because that's very common in the Psukim, Yeratzeh, Lakriv, Hamakrivoto, Lo, no, that's not Yeratzeh, that's Lo Yechashev. But Levatzolam, Lifnei Hashem, Ritzu is the common word used in the Psukim by the Korbanot to mean that the Korban is accepted. And here, you're right, it's the same term that's now being applied to Tefillah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's intentional.
Right, you are correct. It's a good question how much Ritzui gets used by, Meratzeh, Eino Meratzeh, whatever, is a very, very common, not only in the Psukim, but in the technical halachic language of Korbanot. I'd have to think about how much it gets used by Tefillah.
Of rain in its time coming as a divine acknowledgement of
right.
the appropriate moral behavior, let's say, or religious behavior of humanity.
Right. Although I get again, I don't know. Yes. Although I do think it's like an interesting question of the use of Korbanot terminology by Tefillah in general.
Yes.
Right.
It's also we're still tying back on some level to the water libation.
Yes, which is buying L'Ratzo Salamayim.
Right.
That is correct, and that's and it's a very good point. I mean, Rabbi Eliezer's language, quoted in the Bright on Beis Amud Beis, which is Arba Minim Halalu. I think there he used explicitly Hov Arba Minim Halalu in Elu L'Ratzot Alamayim, and that's a very good point, because that is exactly the point that the Ritzui can come before the Bakasha. The sort of getting God, to sort of doing an offering and doing something that God will make God desirous without yet asking for it and without it yet being the time. And here too, the idea is it's a ritzui for the ultimate bakasha. So that's a very good point. Okay, so now we've got that issue about the relationship of the two, but we're not done. So let's take a look. Amar Rabasi, Amar Reb Yochanan. Says Rabasi in the name of Reb Yochanan. We're about 8 lines down by the asterisk and the wide lines. Halacha to Reb Yehuda. We were like Reb Yehuda. We know we do that. We know that we switch off at Musaf on Sukkot and Pesach. So Amalei Rav Zeir Ravasi, so Rav Zeir said to Ravasi, who quoted Reb Yochanan in terms of this psak, Umi Amar Reb Yochanan Hachi, did Reb Yochanan really say that? So now we turn in the Mishnah, B'shlosha b'Mar Cheshvan, Sholiness and Geshamim, you start asking on the 3rd of Mar Cheshvan, Rabbi Gamliel Omer B'Shiva Bo, on the 7th. V'Amar Rabbi Lezer, Halacha Rabbi Gamliel. We were like Rabbi Gamliel, and we start saying Tein Talamatar on the 7th of Mar Cheshvan in Eretz Yisrael. So why is this a problem? So Rav Asi is assuming, again, what we sort of have now has been assuming the opposite, but he's assuming that saying Tein Talamatar is coextensive with Mashiv HaRuach and Morid HaGeshem. So how can you say we were like Reb Yehuda that we do the switch off on Shmini Atzeres? It's not true. We only start saying Tein Talamatar on Mar Cheshvan, 7th of Mar Cheshvan, and he assumes that Tein Talamatar is the same as Mashiv HaRuach. So either they should both be Shmini Atzeres, or the day after Shmini Atzeres, or they should both be Zayim Mar Cheshvan. So it can't be that we rule like Rabbi Yehuda because we rule Zayin Marcheshvan for Tein Talamatar.
I thought the question was, did Rabbi Yochanan say?
Well, that's going to be one of the answers. Amalei Gavra Karamis. What are you bothering me with this? That's one of them is Rabbi Yochanan,
Right.
and the other is Rabbi Lazar. Okay, but the more interesting answer is that why are you assuming that Tein Talamatar is the same as Mashiv Haruach? The Iba is same, and if you want, I could say Lokash Kanlishal Kalahaskir. Exactly the difference that we've been talking about. That even within a Rebbe Yehuda and a Rebbe Yeshua approach, they accept that there's a difference between saying Lahaskir Tein Mashiv Haruach that can begin on Shmini Atzeres, and Tein Talamatar, which begins only on Zayin Marcheshvan. So the Gemara says, 1 minute, that's not an answer. To say it's not Rabbi Yochanan is one thing, but to say that there's a difference between the two, Rabbi Yochanan rejects the idea that there's a difference between the two. The Hamar Rabbi Yochanan says, B'makom sheshoel mazkir, as long as wherever you're asking, you're mentioning. Now, if anybody remembers their, prepositional logic from high school, just because if P then Q doesn't mean, right, if Q then P. Just because every time you say, whenever you're saying Tein Talamatar, you're saying Mashiv Haruach, does not mean that whenever you're saying Mashiv Haruach, you're saying Tein Talamatar. Okay? But the Gemara is assuming that, and it's assuming for Rabbi Yochanan they're completely coextensive. Okay, so the Gemara says, so its first answer is exactly not this. Hahu lahafsaka. That's when it comes to ending, like we said, right? So if you've got, you will visualize this a little bit. Right? If you've got here Shmini Atzeret, right? And then let's say here becomes like this is all Tishrei, right? And then this is Cheshvan and Mar Cheshvan, and then you have 7 Mar Cheshvan here, right? So here what you've got is right. So if you've got basically you're saying here. Lahazkir, you're saying Mashi Faruach, right? Umorida Gesha, okay, which is the key part, fine. Okay, you're saying Lahazkir, and you start saying, and that keeps on going here, right? I'm sorry, is this right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you start saying here, right? You start saying Tein Talamatar. Okay, and then you get to, what do you get to? You get to Tekvav Nisan, right? You get to Pesach. You get to the law. And then you stop saying it. Okay? So he says, yes, when you went the Makom Sheshoel Maskir, as long as you're asking, you're mentioning, that's when it comes to ending. So it means when you stop asking, you don't continue saying, which was a suggestion the Gemara had. Maybe even you stop asking, maybe you should continue saying Mashi Faruach even after you're done asking. No, once you no longer want it, once it's not a lead-in. Right here, it's a lead-in, Richa Shayla, it's a lead-in to begin asking. And as long as you ask, you mention. When you stop asking, you stop mentioning. There's no idea of continuing, and that's what the Gemara said before. That's lahafsik. But to begin, you could begin one before the other. The Gemara says, Hahulaf Saki Itmar. So the Gemara says, wait, we have another statement of Rabbi Yochanan, which really says they're coextensive at both sides. As soon as you start mentioning Mashi Baruch, you start asking, that's explicit, that they start at the same time. Posek Milisho, Posek Malaskin, when you stop asking, you stop mentioning. So Rabbi Yochanan here, this bizarre idea that we thought was, bizarre, that the Gemara assumed that they were completely the same time, this is actually, we find out a position of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, Mashi Baruch and Tein Talamatar all occur at exactly the same time. So how could Rabbi Yochanan say that and say we rule like Rabbi Yehuda? If he's saying we rule like Rabbi Yehuda, it means that we start saying Tein Talamatar day after Shmini Atzeret, because he says Tein Talamatar follows exactly with Mashi Faruach. So the Gemara says, Ela lo kasha, halan halahu. This is for them. This is for us. This is for them. So meaning for us, we would start saying. We would start saying, Mashif. We would start saying Tein Talamatar only on Zayin Marcheshvan. Very bizarre. The Mishnah written in Eretz Yisrael that says Zayin Marcheshvan is talking about Bavel. Okay, we would start saying that only in Bavel.
And
we would wait in Bavel. No. There would presumably be a break. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. Maybe we'd start both of them, but that would be Zayin Marcheshvan. That's for Bavel. That's that Mishnah. And the idea of Reb Yehuda, that's Eretz Yisrael. There we need the rain earlier. So the Gemara says, 1 minute. Maishno l'didan, how's it different for us? Dislan peri bedabra, we still have our crops out in the field and we don't want it to rain, we want it to until later. We don't want rain in Tishrei, we only want it to begin raining in Cheshvan. So that's why you say for us we'll wait till Zayin. L'didu nami, islu oli regalit. The Mishnah says the reason that you wanted to wait till Mar Cheshvan is you wanted to wait for the people who came up for the regal to get home, so they should also be waiting. Now, there's an obvious answer, right? We're talking about nowadays. So the Gemara says no. He's talking that there's no Beis HaMikdash, so therefore in Eretz Yisrael they're happy to have the rain right after Sukkot, and that's when he needs to be paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. And according in Bavel, we'll wait till Mar Cheshvan for the rain, and that's the psak of the next Mishnah. So the Gemara says, now that you've come along to this distinction of whether there's a Beis HaMikdash, it could all work for Eretz Yisrael, which is good because we're talking about Tanaitic sources, so why should it be about Bavel? That the Mishnah that we say we paskin like that you wait till Zayin Mar Cheshvan, that's when there's a Beis HaMikdash. You have to wait for the Oli Regalim to get home. The idea that we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, and again assuming Lahaskir and Lishal are the same thing, that's for nowadays. Nowadays we can get the rain right after Sukkot. So now the Gemara ends. The Anan, the Islan, for us that we hold Trey Yomi, 2 days of Shmini Atzeres, right? Shmini Atzeres and Simchas Torah. When do we do the transition? Because which day is the real Shmini Atzeres? Heichi Avdina, what do? So Amarav Matchil b'Musafim, Uposek b'Mincha Arvis v'Shachris v'Chozer b'Musafim. So you do it on Musaf Shmini Atzeres, then, because you have to do it on the second day too at Musaf, so you have to go back to the normal thing after Musaf and stop saying it, and then it begins saying it again, Musaf on Simchas Torah. So Amalu Shmuel, so Shmuel said to him, Puku v'amrulei la'Abba, or he said to his students, go tell Abba, which is his way of referring respectfully to Rav, Achar Shasito Kodesh, if you said it Musaf or Shmini Atzeres, you've indicated that today is Shmini Atzeres, not that it might be the 7th day. So Taseu Chol, you're going to go back and not say Mashiv HaRuach. By not saying it, you're saying it's still Sukkot. It's not necessarily Shmini Atzeres. Once you say Mashiv HaRuach and Shmini Atzeres, you're indicating it's no longer Sukkot. It really is Shmini Atzeres. So you can't go back now and not say it, which would indicate it's not Shmini Atzeres. So Elam or Shmuel, rather Shmuel says, Matchil b'musafim u'b'mincha. Once you do it at Musaf, you do it at Mincha, because you have to end the day signifying that you're treating it as Shmini Atzeres. U'posek Arvis v'Shachris. But then, when it comes Simchas Torah, then it's a new day. Now we can go back to pretending that today might be Shmini Atzeres, and if today Simchas Torah was Shmini Atzeres, we wouldn't be saying it Ma'ariv and Shachris. V'chozer matchil b'musafim, and you go back, and then you start saying it in Musaf. So you have to replay the day when it gets to be the next day. And Rava Amar, Kivan Shahid Chil Shuvein Posek, which is obviously what we do. Excuse me. Once you start saying Mashiv HaRuach, you've indicated that now is the time for Mashiv HaRuach Mordei Geshem, and from Shmini Atzeres on, you're not going to change, which is clearly our psak. But just to go back and say that the Gemara ended up with a position of Rabbi Yochanan, which we had been avoiding, but it clearly is Rabbi Yochanan's position, which is that Mashiv HaRuach is exactly coextensive with Tein Tolamato Livracha. And then it becomes the question, do you start saying both of them on Shmini Atzeres, or the day after, Sukkot, and you start asking, or do you start waiting for both of them until Zayin Mar Cheshvan? And rather than sort of choose, the Gemara says, well, maybe it makes a difference, the time of the Beis HaMikdash, not the time of the Beis HaMikdash. But for us, what's conceptually interesting is that the whole earlier part of the daf had worked to separate those two, and that obviously is the way we paskin. We paskin that you say Mashiv HaRuach from Shmini Atzeres, and you start and you ask only in Zayin Cheshvan. But we have a Rabbi Yochanan position that really brings the two of them together. All right, I'll take your question.
But you still don't get them exactly together.